Today's question is, are you abnormal? Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel Berger. Today we're going to be distinguishing between what exactly is normal and what is abnormal, what is disordered and what is ordered, and how are we to determine this? What reliable source, what authority can we determine what is normal and abnormal? As we begin this discussion, I want you to consider what exactly is normal. We're not going to take the time today to look at quotes by secular experts on what exactly is the standard of normalcy. However, as you study it out, they widely say it's a fluid concept. In fact, if we were to take the evolutionary concept and apply it to this Kreplinian theory of mental illness, what you would find is there can't be, within evolutionary thinking, a standard of what is normal, because essentially, according to the theory, everyone is evolving. We should all, theoretically, be in different places on this spectrum of evolution. And so forming a standard of order in order to determine who is disordered isn't actually feasible. The idea of disorder, as I'll address in another video, comes from the idea of degeneration, which was a Nazi eugenics concept. And of course, we don't use that term today. Now we use the preferred term disorder. But essentially, you must have a theory of order in order to have disorder. In fact, to suggest that there is an abnormality without an established standard is a logical fallacy. It can't happen. Think about math, for example. In order to have a deviance, you must have an established point. You must have a standard set. And so as we look at this today, who is quote unquote normal and who is abnormal, I want you to keep that truth in mind. But I want to address something philosophically that undergirds the secular theory of what is normal and what is abnormal as we begin. And that is a somewhat passive teaching of anthropology. And by that I mean they're not coming out and saying, here's an anthropology that you need to accept that's evolutionary and humanistic. Most Christians would reject that outright if that's the approach. And what they do is they teach what is abnormal. They want you to believe dogmatically a theory of abnormality without realizing that your entire anthropology, your standard of what is normal, is shifting in the process. And this is the deceit from 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, that we are called to destroy. It raises itself against the knowledge of God. We must get back as Christians to see ourselves through a biblical lens of what is normal, and we must get back as Christians to a biblical worldview that rightly understands who we are through the lens of Scripture. If we don't, we're accepting the philosophies of man that don't help us to deal with very real struggles. And that is important as we begin. Your struggles are real, but how you interpret them is incredibly important. Are you abnormal and disordered, or are you exactly what God says? Yes, you're struggling. You are vexed. You're in a fallen world. You're under the curse, both of your physical nature and the noetic effects on your mind. But does it mean that you're disordered? So I want to give us 4 things today to consider about normalcy and alleged or proposed abnormalcy. What is the actual standard? Is there an objective standard that we can look at? And I think by exposing how seculars contrive the idea of disorder, we will be able to understand how normalcy should be thought of. You're going to see exactly how they have formed this idea of abnormality, and also we'll look just briefly at a biblical understanding. The first thing I would like to look at is a historical perspective. Point number 1, we're going to look at a brief history of the DSM itself. Now, I'm going to tell you, we're not going to go back to the father, Emil Kraepelin. I'll save that for another time. However, what we're going to do here is look specifically at the transition from the DSM-2 to the DSM-3. And that brings us to Dr. Bob Spitzer. The first way that secularists developed their modern concept of abnormal is found in Dr. Bob Spitzer and what he did specifically with homosexuality. Now, many people don't realize the history of how the American Psychiatric Association essentially operated on the Freudian theory of mental illness, psychoanalysis, the id, the ego, the superego, and all of that stuff, which we won't also get into in this video. And between the DSM-2 and the DSM-3, around the 1960s into the 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association switched from Freudianism to Kraepelinianism. And you can see this transition in the actual labels. And by the way, the DSM-3 became extra thick. It went from a somewhat thin book of psychiatric nostalgia to a very thick book, and it's only gotten thicker. We are now in the DSM-5 TR, or Text Revised version. The DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. You're going to hear this quite a bit as we talk about today, this book, often called the Psychiatric Bible. And so as they transition from the DSM-2 to the DSM-3, something very interesting happened. Now, again, this is not a video about homosexuality. It's also not a video about the genetic theories involved both in homosexuality or in mental illness or mental disorders. And so I want to make that distinction as I discuss this. However, the history, as I pointed out, is relevant. And so let's look at that today. As you can imagine, in today's culture, homosexuality being considered as a mental disorder would be absolutely taboo. It would be not just frowned upon, but anyone who said that that was accurate would be canceled. We are in the middle of cancel culture, and yet that did not happen. What did happen is a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Bob Spitzer, who, quite frankly, as you'll see, invented more psychiatric disorders than anyone else in history. The LGBT movement in the early 1970s, late 1960s, was really becoming a strong organization. And they approached the American Psychiatric Association and said, you need to stop doing the barbaric things to us and saying that we're mentally disordered. Some of the things they were doing, what we would today call waterboarding. They were sterilizing them. They were doing lobotomies. They were doing all kind of isolation treatments and various things to, quote unquote, treat people with homosexuality. And of course, we know that is an inaccurate view of homosexuality. But the LGBT movement approached Dr. Bob Spitzer and said, you have an option here. You either take us out of the new DSM-3, or we're going to expose you as just creating constructs and trying to control society. You're creating these social constructs in order to try to control what is viewed as normal and abnormal. In reality, if you think about it, it's not just a standard of what is, quote unquote, mental disorder and what is not. This is an entirely moral perspective. By framing what is abnormal, they were actually attempting to take morality out and make themselves the determiner of what is good and acceptable. We see this in the natural sciences as well, not just in behavioral science. We are told what is good. For example, cutting down a tree and killing a tree, in many people's perspective, is worse than killing a baby. That's a moral perspective. So what I'd like to do is give you the perspective on this history from some of the leading experts in psychiatry. In other words, don't take my word for it. I want you to see how normalcy, the battle for normalcy, and the idea of abnormalcy is directly related to this history. So let's start with Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, who is the chair of psychiatry, or was the chair of psychiatry at Columbia University. He also was the president-elect of the American Psychiatric Association when the DSM-5, not the Text Revised, but the DSM-5 was published. And so you'll see his name in that version. But let's look what he has to say about this history. Spitzer found himself in a troubling intellectual bind. On one hand, the anti-psychiatry movement was stridently arguing that all mental illnesses were artificial social constructions perpetuated by power-hungry psychiatrists. Like everyone at the APA, which is the American Psychiatric Association, Bob Spitzer knew these arguments were taking a toll on the reliability of his profession. He believed that mental illnesses were genuine medical disorders rather than social constructs. But now he was about to declare homosexuality to be exactly such a social construct. If he disavowed homosexuality, he could open the door to the anti-psychiatrists to argue that other disorders, such as schizophrenia and depression, should also be disavowed. Very, very interesting perspective, is it not? That if you're going to claim that things like homosexuality, keep in mind they were diagnosing dogmatically people as homosexual, and you're going to do that, but then all of a sudden say, you know what, homosexuality isn't a real disease, our bad. That's called malpractice in valid medicine. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened in history. What was called a medical disorder was magically then just attributed to a social construction and immediately taken out very quietly. But let's keep looking at this from this, quote, expert perspective. Another American Psychiatric Association president, former president, John Oldham, says this: what qualified as an actual legitimate illness and what didn't was really an interesting history. Sexual disorders were classified as personality disorders in the DSM-1. That is a very different way that we later thought about it when they became viewed as disorders all by themselves. But it was the progress based on the courage of this man and many others who followed that led to the recognition that sexual orientation was not something that should be qualified or classified as an illness. Now, let me just say, if in fact something were discovered in science that would show this, then we could begin to discuss and argue this. However, this was a social group putting pressure on Dr. Bob Spitzer. It wasn't that he had much boldness, it's that he was threatened if he did not change this, then their entire paradigm for creating what is allegedly abnormal would be exposed. But let's continue on here and look at a couple more quotes. Dr. Greenberg also says something similar about this history. When doctors said homosexuality was a disease, that was not an opinion, let alone bigotry. It was a fact. When they wrote that fact down in the DSM, it was not a denunciation, it was a diagnosis. The prejudices and fallacies behind psychiatric diagnoses and even the interests they serve are as visible to us all, doctors and patients alike, as they were to all those doctors who treated homosexuals. It wasn't until 2019 when a global genetic study on homosexuality, a massive study, came out showing that there is no genetic link to homosexuality. In other words, the entire eugenic concept that was prevalent during the Holocaust that the American Psychiatric Association had adopted both from Kraepelin and from Freud. It was a very common way of thinking, that eugenic thinking. It was rejected in 2019 and not before that. Despite them taking it out, they secretly theorized that someone was disordered, that they had digressed, or the word that the Nazi used, they had degenerated to a lesser evolutionary stage. That was the theory until this study in 2019. Dr. Jerome Frank, who was a beloved Harvard psychiatrist, based on this and many other things, once said, psychotherapy may be the only treatment that creates the illnesses it treats. That brings us to our second point on considering how normalcy and alleged abnormality is established within secular theory, and that is the creation of a new disease concept. Now, I'm not going to look at the DSM task force and how they sit around and they agree upon what distresses and impairments should be considered to be DSM labels or DSM categories or disorders. We'll reserve that for another time. What I do want to look at is this history of Bob Spitzer a little bit closer. And we're going to cite some of the same figures within psychiatry in order to do this. Now, in regards to this history with Dr. Bob Spitzer, I'd like to cite Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman again. Remember, he was a former president of the American Psychiatric Association. Listen to what he says in his books, Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry. This was a definition of mental illness radically different from anything before. Not only was it far removed from the psychoanalytic view that a patient's mental illness could be hidden from the patient herself, but it also amended Emil Kraepelin's definition. which was made no reference to subjective distress and considered short-lived conditions to be illness as well, or two. He's pointing out that Dr. Bob Spitzer actually created a new definition of mental disorder. It differed from what Freud taught, and it differed from what Kraepelin taught. And that is significant. We're going to get back to this, and I'm going to show you exactly how he did it. We're going to look at 3 ways coming up here that you're going to see how he did this in history, how everything changed from the DSM to the DSM-3, and this new Kraepelinian view, and that's why the system is called the neo-Kraepelinian, or as they prefer, once again, the biopsychosocial model. The neo-Kraepelinian model was formed. But let's look at a couple more quotes before we get to that. And that brings us to Ronald Pice, or Pies, depending on where you're from, who was the editor-in-chief, and now he's the editor-in-chief emeritus of the Psychiatric Times. That is the official trade journal of the American Psychiatric Association. So this is a very significant figure in psychiatry. And I want you to listen to how he defines this new idea of disease that Lieberman pointed out Bob Spitzer created. Listen to what he says. Indeed, disease is a pre-biological construct. Now let me pause there and just highlight for you what he's saying is that if we create a construct, we can view it as a disease without any biology. Think about that a second in regard to psychiatric, quote unquote, disorders. Well, this is an entirely different view if you were to study medicine of what we would consider to be a disease, something that has biology, something that has biological markers, that actually has a physical pathology to it. Now, let me just say before we continue looking at his quote, that we are in no way saying to deny the label is to deny that you're struggling. In many cases, what I found is when we eliminate the label, we actually discover valid physical causes to things like not sleeping, which lead to psychosis. And so by framing it within these constructs and just calling that a disorder or a disease, we don't do a favor to the person actually struggling. And that's part of why I'm taking the effort here to explain this so thoroughly. But let's continue with what Dr. Pice says. It begins with ordinary people perceive that one of their fellows is experiencing prolonged suffering and incapacity without evident external cause, such as an obvious wound. The biology of disease often eludes us for decades or even centuries after the condition is widely recognized as a disease. As a physician, Maimonides reminds us 8 centuries ago, disease, etymologically, dis-ease, is properly predicated of persons. When we attribute disease to the mind or body or to organs and tissues, we balkanize, which means to divide, the human experience of disease and create great conceptual mischief. Thus, the commonly used terms brain disease and mental illness are both conceptually unsatisfactory. Now, this is a loaded quote, and we're not going to take time to fully go through this, but I want to highlight just 2 things. First of all, he says that dis-ease, or literally without ease, someone who is struggling, they are impaired in some way, they could be considered to be disordered. Now, that is actually how, as we'll see, this idea of disorder or the disease, the mental illness concept is formed. The second thing I want you to see is that he rejects biblical dualism here. He's confounding the mind and the brain because they accept what's called bioreductionism or naturalism, physicalism, materialism. All those words are used to describe their rejection of biblical dualism. If you are impaired physically or spiritually, they feel comfortable calling you disordered or diseased. And that is really, really troubling, but it's also very telling. As we return to this history of Dr. Bob Spitzer, I want to cite someone who's been critical of him, Dr. Greenberg. Listen to what he says in noting this history, which, by the way, he interviewed many of these prominent psychiatrists. Spitzer did something else to juice the credibility of the DSM-3, something that no one else had done, at least not in diagnostic manual. He tried to define disease. Spitzer understood from the beginning that the common sense definition of disease, a progressive physical disorder with known pathophysiology, simply couldn't be stretched to cover mental illness. He finesses this problem by proposing that disease was only one of of a number of medical disorders, conditions that had negative consequences, an inferred or identified organismic dysfunction, and an implicit call to action. Mental disorder, he argued, was a medical disorder whose manifestations are primarily signs or symptoms of a psychological behavioral nature. This was a clever move on Spitzer's part, acknowledging that mental illness were not diseases in the usual sense, even as he preserved their place in real medicine. So you can see Dr. Bob Spitzer was saying, we're going to create a new idea of disease. That's exactly what Jeffrey Lieberman said. And as we saw from Ronald Pies, he created this idea of disease being, if you are impaired in any way, if life is not easy for long enough, then you can be qualified as having a mental disorder. And let's look at one more from neuroscientist Sidney Walker. Positive understanding, knowing why symptoms occur, is the foundation of medical care. Doctors are trained to begin with patient symptoms and work from there. By taking compulsively thorough medical and personal histories, conducting in-depth physical and neurological examinations, ordering appropriate neurophysiological evaluations and biochemical studies, and evaluating the results of brain scans and other tests until a definitive diagnosis can be made. This medical detective work, known as deductive differential diagnoses, is the cornerstone of medicine. But modern psychiatry has attempted to shortcut the process with a book known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. In doing so, psychiatry has replaced the science of diagnosis with the pseudoscience of labeling. How we think directly affects our bodies. It is vital for us to understand this. When you get anxious, you can immediately feel your hands getting clammy and your stomach churning and temperature going up, heart rate going up, etc. These are all biological effects of a very real phenomena that occurs in the soul. So if we're going to say that every effect of something mental is what we're going to call disease, well, that's also twisting what's going on here. Dr. Herb Cutchins and Dr. Stuart Kirk, who also served as consultants on DSM Task Force, say this about Dr. Bob Spitzer. The homosexuality controversy illustrates a major theme, namely that science is often not central to the decision to include or exclude a diagnosis from the DSM. The dispute over the inclusion of homosexuality in the DSM was not about research findings. It was about a 20-year-old debate about beliefs and values. Although the professionals who formulated diagnoses couched their arguments in the language of science, the actual influence of empirical data was negligible. More often than not, the issues were settled by political compromises that promoted personal interest. Likewise, an older textbook, Biological Psychiatry, has this to say: the extent to which diagnostic schemes are influenced by societal standards is highlighted by the disappearance of homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder in more recent versions of the manual. It also partly reflects the emergence of new human rights movements. Whoever's given the most authority, whoever's given the greatest ability to decide what is true and what is false, what is abnormal and what is normal, what are the standards of how we view mindsets and emotions and behaviors, they get to determine what society should accept. And that's what we see, whether it's this social agenda, whether it's the woke culture, or it's humanistic thinkers, theorists who sit around and form these constructs and then call them diseases and tell people they are disordered just like homosexuals were. That reality undergirds what is considered normal and abnormal, sadly, in the United States today. So this concludes the first video on this subject. In the next video, we will continue to look at this idea of normal versus abnormal. How do psychiatrists sell this idea of disordered? And we're going to specifically look at the 3 axioms. I hope you'll like this video and I hope you'll share this video. But I also hope that you'll join us to continue this conversation. Am I abnormal? Have a wonderful day and may the truth set you free.